You're listening to Psych with Mike. For more episodes or to connect with the show with comments, ideas, or to be a guest, go to www.psychwithmike.com. Follow the show on Twitter @PsychWithMike or like the Facebook page @PsychWithMike. Now, here's Psych with Mike.
Welcome to the Psych with Mike Library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan, and I am here with Mr. Brett Newcomb.
Good morning.
I was kind of laughing a little bit because I always ask you if you're ready, and you always say yes, but you always say it in a way that feels half-hearted.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
You want to say more about that?
I mean, it just feels like you're like I say, hey, are you ready? And you're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay. I don't know how to read that. But I think so this is my interpretation. And
sometimes a good cigar is just a cigar.
Yeah, I know. My thinking is that you are thinking ahead to what you're going to say about the topic.
You give me entirely too much credit.
Okay, all right.
I'm way more spontaneous than that.
Okay, all right. So then I sit corrected.
Yeah.
So
Well, you should be used to that.
How are you today?
I'm doing well.
Yeah. My sinuses are bad today. I don't know.
It's a rainy day in St. Louis.
Yeah, which is usually not good for my sinuses.
Yeah.
So I am a huge believer in the idea of identity. I believe that the individual's identity is a substructure of the ego. So when we think about the Freudian model of id, ego, superego, id are all of the things that we're born with. So our instincts, it's driven by the pleasure principle. I want what I want, and I want it now. The ego forms later, and it grows to bind the id so that we can delay gratification of needs to an appropriate time, or so that we can redirect that energy if those desires are inappropriate. And then the superego, it becomes this voice in your head that you carry around that tells you what's right and wrong and stuff like that. But the ego, I've always been fascinated with. And I believe that inside of the ego lives what we consider our identity, and that a lot of what we experienced as angst or human suffering is really about the identity suffering some kind of insult, something that undermines our perception of the identity. And then that really, really causes anxiety, existential anxiety, because then we feel like we don't know who we are. And so I loved this article because I feel like that a lot of what this article is talking about ties actually directly into that.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought you had more. So the article talks about this new conceptualization that trauma, so everything in psychology right now is trauma-based, right? So trauma-informed therapy, trauma this, trauma that. And I'm not making fun of that, because I believe that trauma is a very real thing, and that it is responsible for much more of human pathology than we've ever given it credit for. But I think we've always talked about things that people are struggling with, even when we didn't use the word trauma. And what I'm afraid of is that in the present moment, we may be minimizing the import of the word trauma because we use it for everything. Do you agree with that?
No.
Okay.
No, because I think it's a really significant. I mean, I can't define the reality or the level of your experience. You have to do that.
Right.
So I need to hear what you can share with me. Mm-hmm. I believe that, especially in infancy, there are any number of insults to the ego that we can define as trauma. Mm-hmm. But I think that we get a field when we start trying to hierarchically score severity of trauma. The trauma is what happened to you and how you experienced it. It's not my judgment about it. So if your father spanked you with his bare hand on your butt, and you're all traumatized about that, but I was spanked by my father on my bare butt with an extension cord. We had two different levels of physical experience and emotional experience. But that doesn't mean that your trauma is more or less than mine. And so I think we have to be real careful categorically coming up with that terminology.
Right. And excuse me. And so the way in which, or let me clarify, I believe trauma is a real thing, and I believe that every person's experience is their reality, and that their experience is true for them, even if other people do not objectively agree with it. I'm all for that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But what I'm wondering is that, we have a society now where an entire generation of children is growing up and have never heard the word no, and have been indulged to the point where when they go out into the real world and they do experience the word no, then they kind of fall apart.
So I'm reading a book right now.
Yeah.
I don't remember, Marston? I can't remember his name. But it's pretty popular. It's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck.
Yeah.
Is the name of the book.
Okay. We'll bleep that.
Why? It's the name of the book.
Okay.
All right.
No,
we'll go back to the conversation.
No, go ahead.
He talks extensively about the philosophy in the 60s and 70s that every child has to win, that no child can experience emotional trauma. They all have to get rewards. They all have to get certificates and ribbons. And you never tell them no, and they can't be allowed to fail. Then you create this generation of people that have never learned to push against resistance, that have never learned to cope with disappointment. And that creates a lot of chaos in our culture because people don't know how to handle circumstances of life. And
then when they do get confronted with that, they are ill-equipped. And so that's what I mean by, do we minimize the idea of trauma by saying everybody has the right to claim whatever their experience is as traumatic? So I guess what I'm saying is, so if you have a person who is raised with an entitled attitude and they go out into the real world and they experience no for the first time and they fall apart, I guess in reality that is traumatic for them.
Well, yeah, but it may be their first owned or recognized experience of trauma, so they don't have any skills for coping with it or surviving it.
So that's the real issue, is not whether or not that's traumatic.
Well, yeah, but I mean, we can all look at a set of circumstances. I was thinking about this because I read this article, thinking about my own childhood and conversations I've had with other people about theirs. And before the age of 5, you have what are called snapshot memories.
Right.
You don't have sequenced memories that come, as this article talks about, with the story woven around them, an interpretation of them. You just have a little glimpse. I remember being less than 3, just a snapshot of someone knocking over a dresser in my bedroom that was against a door. And what I know now, years later as an adult, we lived at that time in a duplex. And my grandparents lived on one side of it, and my parents and my brother and I lived on the other side of it. My brother and I were in our bedroom, and apparently my parents were gone. And my grandparents were trying to get to us we were crying or hungry or wet or whatever the heck was going on. But the only way they could get there was to break open the connecting door between the two halves of the house, which my parents had blocked that wall with a dresser. Not blocked it so much, but that's where they put the furniture. And so I remember the dresser falling over and crashing on the floor, and my grandfather opening the door and rushing in. But I assumed we were crying at the time. Certainly started crying when that happened. But that's a trauma memory. Now, was I in that moment being traumatized by somebody? Was somebody torturing me or child abusing me or hurting me? Not that I know of, not that I'm aware of, not that I remember. This article talks about those experiences being divorced from the story that you tell yourself about your life.
Right.
And it talks a lot as life goes on. They're doing objective scientific research into people's trauma memory experiences, trying to find out ways to identify, is there continuity to the story of their life and their sense of self and experience, or is there discontinuity that's caused by interruptions of different traumas? That's intellectually an interesting proposition.
Yeah.
Does it make a difference in terms of doing therapy with the average client that walks in off the street? I don't know. I'm not sure that it does.
Right.
It may make a difference in your skill set as a provider in terms of neuro-linguistic programming. Do I hear the language they use? Does that inform me above and beyond just the word usage? Because people will say, I think, or I hear, I feel. And that gives you an indication of their resources.
Right.
And so then you have a slightly clearer picture of how to see them and how they see the world. So that helps. But this article to me is more interesting from a research perspective and a training perspective for clinicians to help them understand what the client is relating when they tell something, when they tell a story.
The thing that I found so interesting about the article was this idea that trauma distorts our perception of time.
Yes, and I would agree with that 100%.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was reading the article, it just rang so true, both for me in my life, but also my experience as a clinician.
Oh, yeah.
And the way that they talk about the use of language, that we actually become stuck in the moment
We've
of
all had
trauma.
slow motion experiences. I remember one time driving a car, my wife and child in the car. We were on a long road trip, and we went through a winter storm, and we hit a patch of black ice. Couldn't see it. Didn't know it was on the road. Tapped my brakes, my car spun out of control. It literally spun 360s around, across, between oncoming traffic that fortunately didn't hit their brakes because they knew they were on black ice or were asleep at the wheel. But they didn't touch their brakes. We went through the line of traffic, down into a ditch on the other side, back out, through the line of traffic, through the other line of traffic, down into the ditch, back out, straightened up and went on. And I can see that in absolute slow motion. I can see myself pushing my wife and my child down on the floor, trying to hold them down in case we hit something, while I'm trying to steer the car without touching the brake again. I mean, that's all so slow. Now, it may have happened over a 2-minute period. In my mind, it's like a 5-minute episode of absolute terror. So, yeah, I think those experiences distort your time sense.
Right. So it distorts our time sense. We get locked into that experience and we ruminate on that. So we play it over and over again in our heads. But then what the article...
Well, as soon as you hear it back. I mean, my wife would say to me on occasion, I remember when you almost killed us.
Yeah. Well, that was her sense of the event. But then the event has an influence on our perception of self across the timeline, and that was so powerful for me was that we have these experiences of trauma. We get locked into those experiences. It changes our perception of time, but then because it changes our perception of time and we get locked into that moment, it also alters our sense of self across time.
So what I took from that article was that when you are telling someone your trauma memories, your life story, you can tell the most horrific experiences in colorful detail without feeling it. And that is an outgrowth of this trauma memory distortion. I can tell you a very entertaining story about trauma memories from my childhood. Entertaining in the sense that you will be gripped by the story. And I can tell it so that I can manipulate the mood of the audience, sad, angry, funny, whatever. But I'm not currently feeling anything.
Right.
And the research writers here are saying, is it possible that that's a unique circumstance? While you're telling the story, you're not in touch with it empathically? Or is that how you've structured your internalization of it? Have you separated from the memory the affect? And so then the question becomes, how do you experience current affect? Are you limited in some way with your ability to feel emotions when they reach a certain level of intensity because they approach a trauma trigger for you, based on whatever your past trauma triggers have been? And is that impacting your relationships in your life today? Are you having trouble in your relationships because you have all these trauma memories that have cushioned you affectively so that you can't feel things?
Right. Okay.
Unless they reach the level of trauma.
Let's run to our break, and I'm going to respond to that on the way outside.
Okay.
Hey, Brett, if you were going to tell somebody to check out something on the internet to help them with their mental health, what would you tell them?
I'd tell them to listen to Psych with Mike.
Why would you tell them that?
Because it's probably one of the most easily listenable experiences you can have that will give you information that's useful for a whole spectrum of concerns that people have.
I agree, and I have actually been told that by at least a dozen people, several of whom were not married to me, and some of them didn't even know me.
That's amazing.
That is amazing. It's when we get that kind of feedback from people, it is so incredibly humbling and overwhelming for me.
It is for both of us.
Yeah. So we really appreciate it, and as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike. Okay, we're back. So you're talking about this idea that we have these trauma events and we numb ourselves affectively, A-F-F-E-C-T, feeling.
In order to share them.
Right. Or to just think about them.
Yeah.
But we don't have any feeling
Current
connection to them.
I don't panic again.
But we know that there are some people who experience trauma, and they do. So when you have post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a lot of times...
You have flashbacks.
Yeah, you have flashbacks. And when you're in the flashback, your affect is off the charts.
Yeah.
And so I think that you can have trauma where as a defense mechanism...
So I think where most people have that experience is when they have nightmares. In the sleep, you're having the trauma memory.
And you're connected to it effectively.
Your body is feeling it because your consciousness is not blocking.
Yeah.
So then you wake up and your fist is doubled, you're breathing hard, you're racing, you're gasping. Somebody wakes you up because you're moaning or crying. And then all of a sudden you're like, yeah, I'm fine. It's okay. Yeah.
But I think human beings can have both experiences. I think we can have trauma where we mute the affect, but I think we can also have trauma where the affect is exponentially increased.
Yeah.
Where,
And I would agree.
And I would argue that the difference there, is the difference between an acute trauma, which creates post-traumatic stress. So you can experience post-traumatic stress from an acute trauma, one-time event, or from a chronic trauma over a period of time. I think the chronic trauma fits more with what this article is talking about. I think in chronic trauma, the individual learns how to be able to care for themselves by muting the affect so you can live in the trauma situation, right? So any child who grew up in a dysfunctional household learned how to be able to do that by muting their affect associated with that trauma. But then there are some traumas, like we're in war and you get blown up in a Humvee and you see a bunch of your friends get killed and dismembered. That situation creates post-traumatic stress in the instant, and then when that gets triggered, you're right back there in the Humvee and freaking out.
Yeah, and as a clinician, you need to be aware of that distinction because in today's world, we have so many veterans who are suffering PTSD from fighting in the forever wars that we've gotten involved in the last 20 years. So you're likely to have clients come in who have had that experience, even if that's not what's bringing them in. Maybe they're coming in because they can't find a job and they're distraught, or because they're going through a divorce and they are unhappy, or their children are troubled and they don't know what to do. I mean, there's some colorful surface level event, but underneath it's being driven by their trauma reactions that are one-time learning for them, and experience them intensely, re-experience them intensely when a trigger occurs, like a backfire of a car, or a loud noise of some kind. I think you're right. The distinction needs to be made.
Yeah.
They're both kinds of trauma memories.
And so when I was reading this article, that was one thing that I took away from this, is that I wouldn't want anybody to read this article and assume that when people have trauma, that they mute the affective part of that. Either of those things can happen, and I think the difference, the axis upon which those revolve, is the difference between acute trauma and a chronic trauma. So in chronic traumas, people are going to tend to mute the affect. In acute traumas, people are going to tend to experience the affect exponentially.
Yeah.
So if you have a sexual assault, that's an acute trauma, and many times those individuals will re-experience that, and the affect will just be off the charts. So
Well-
as a clinician, you have to attend to that and recognize that when they're bringing that affect, that's more of an acute trauma. When you see the affect muted, that's more of a chronic trauma, because I think it informs how you then respond.
And I think maybe it's beneficial if we talk about the medical model uses the term acute and chronic as a measure of intensity and pervasiveness. So if you have an acute pain, you suddenly get an acute pain in your rib
Stabbing,
cage.
yeah.
It's a stabbing pain, it's a sharp pain, it's a sudden pain. It's not just there all the time in the background. Chronic pain is there all the time in the background.
Right.
And it affects how you walk, how you hold yourself, how you sleep, how you relax or don't. I mean, so they're different etiologies and different treatment protocols.
So the article talks about treating this chronic trauma experience and this muting of the affect with helping the client to be able to reconstruct a more consistent and more complete story. Do you, when you read that, did that speak to you? Did that
No.
feel like, okay,
No.
I was wondering.
Because I don't know. As I read it and tried to understand what they were describing, I don't know that I work that way or have that kind of training to be able to do that. I also don't know that I have that kind of time to work with a client over the protocol they were describing, which is a multi-year re-experiencing, retelling, reworking, and then the analysis of all the verbiage that they use. Which verbs did they use? Which nouns did they use? Did they use we or I, us or them? You know, that kind of stuff is not the work I do. It's not the work I'm trained to do. So I don't know. I don't have an opinion about it.
So what do you typically do?
Listen and reflect back what I'm hearing,
Yeah.
and ask them if you could change your language to this. I mean, because I believe words matter.
Right.
So if I'll work with a client and say, when you hear all these shoulds in your head, can you teach yourself when you hear a should, I must do this? Can you say I will or I won't instead? Because I think you can make progress that way. You can experiment with that, and you can test that in the office with me. You don't have to go take it on the road and take a risk and have things blow up out of your control. So if your shoulds are telling you, Grandma's sick, she's in hospice care, you need to go see her this weekend. You must go see Grandma. And it's your mother, it's your dad, it's your brothers, whoever it is, but you hear these voices in your head. And you say to yourself, I'm not going to do that. I have this other commitment for my job in Houston this weekend. If she's still alive, I'll go see her when I get back. And if she's not, she'll understand. So can you imagine that? Can you have that conversation with yourself? Can we try it on here in the office and see what kind of anxiety comes up for you, or what kind of sense? Is you shame, embarrassment, anger? What happens? And then we work through that.
So that particular example, I would define as guilt.
Okay.
But now you are actually bringing up an interesting point. Do you think guilt is trauma?
I think guilt is a script that was written for you by other people trying to control your choices.
Absolutely. But do you think that can be experienced as traumatic?
I think it can be. I don't think it has to be.
Yeah. I'm trying to find what they actually called this therapy in the article, but I am not finding. They named it something. Do you remember?
No, I don't remember. But it was they were doing some kind of survey every 4 years. And then they had all these people that they trained to come in, and they taped the stories, and they broke down every word, every tense, and categorized them, made flow charts of them, and learned something from that.
Right.
So, but I don't remember what they called it.
Yeah. It was something cognitive therapy.
Immersive learning? No, that's not it.
But what I was wondering is, from reading this article, I'm wondering if we had the authors of this article here, I wonder how they would say that this particular approach differs from what Viktor Frankl called logotherapy. Because a lot of what they talk about in this article feels very much to me like what Frankl did, although what I didn't get from this article that they obviously do have is as a central foundational pillar of logotherapy is this idea that the individual is the person who is responsible for their own experience and the development of their own story. And I didn't get that as much from this article, but I think in the end, the individual client has to be the person that is responsible for that. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and this is a difference again between you and I. You are fascinated by these terminologies that people use, and you put a lot of your emotional, intellectual currency into understanding them. I don't. To me, it all comes down to what's going on with my client, how do they get better, how can I help them get better. This other stuff to me may be interesting, but it's interesting from a curiosity standpoint, and for you it seems to be something more than that.
So have you ever had a client come to your office where you developed the clinical perception that their storyline, their sense of selfness, their identity was fractured in the way that this article talks about, and then thought, oh, what I need to do is repair that narrative?
No.
Yeah.
Again, not using the verbiage that you're using today. I have had clients that have come in distraught and afraid that they might have terrifying memories that they can't recall, but they have the sense that it's there, like a pregnant pause, and they're afraid that that memory is going to flood them all of a sudden and cause them to have a car wreck or jump off a building or do some drastic thing. And my response to that has always been, your selective retention of memories, the way I would say this is, everything we do operates in service of the self. And so if your self is not strong enough to handle the recovery of that memory, you can't recover it.
Right.
And they say, well, how about hypnosis? And I say, yeah, I can hypnotize you, and we can get that memory from wherever it is stored and tape it and play it back for you. Or I can tell you when you come out of hypnosis, remember it, and you can remember it, but it won't have affect attached to it. It won't be your memory. It'll just be a story. Until you are strong enough to remember it, you won't remember it. And so then what happens, again in my experience, as they get emotionally stronger and more capable of handling it, then they get glimpses, they get flashbacks of what may be coming. But they have the resources to cope with it. They don't completely fall apart. They don't kill themselves. They don't kill somebody else. They have difficult times. It hurts. It's scary. But they can handle it. And then as they get stronger and stronger, they eventually can afford to remember it. And then we can process it. What do you need to do with all this? How does that affect your relationship or your understanding or the way you behave? What do you want to do with it? Now you have power.
So maybe the thing that spoke to me most deeply about this article was this idea that gaps in the memory are evidence of a fractured or incomplete story about the self.
Yeah.
And I know that for me, like, I have I don't have any really significant conscious memories before the age of like 11. And that's always bothered me.
Yeah.
And I've talked to therapists about it, and they've done the thing that, like you just talked about, well, we could try and reconstruct that, but we would probably be reconstructing a false narrative unless you came up with it spontaneously. And if you don't, then there's probably not real value in trying to focus on reconstructing that narrative. But it seems to me like this article is recommending that you help the client reconstruct a narrative.
And it's suggesting a path by which you can do that.
Right.
Which is just another way of doing business.
But I'm wondering, so this is where I'm torn about. If a person reconstructs a narrative that may not be factually accurate, but allows them to internalize a more functional sense of self, is that okay?
Well, my question would be, is it a narrative that you constructed, or is it one that was constructed for you by the trauma perpetrators? Did people tell you, no, you don't remember that accurately? Grandpa didn't do that. That was Uncle Fred, or that was the man down the street. That wasn't Grandpa, or that wasn't Daddy. I don't trust that until you're strong enough to truly remember. Then my question is, can you trust yourself?
Right.
You know, all this conversation in this article reminded me of some research that I used to be very familiar with, and now I'm blanking on a lot of it. But there was a British psychiatrist named Winnicott who wrote extensively on the difference between the false self and the true self. And the false self is the comforting image of yourself that you created to make it livable in your environment. Because if your memory or feelings were different, like if you grew up in an alcoholic family, one of the things you learn in an alcoholic family is denial, denial, denial.
Right.
Don't talk. Don't talk outside the home about what goes on here. We have to have this image that we project. So you learn to live and wear and think the image. In our house, everything's perfect. No problems at all. You go out to school, and you don't talk about any troubles that you have at home. So you learn to present this false self. Then you go home, and a switch clicks. You know you're home now, and it's a dangerous place to be. So you have to be different. You have to be aware. You have to be hyper alert. You have to be able to avoid the danger zones. So Winnicott wrote extensively about how to identify the false self and how to connect to the true self, which I think is I mean, this is just another way to do it. There's another approach to it.
Yeah.
It's like having multiple, fine china, everyday dishes, which works best for you.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, in the end, I thought this was a fascinating article. I thought it was
interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. But more from a research perspective.
Yes, but more as an esoteric kind of intellectual exercise than something that I would see myself.
Fill in your background, not necessarily something you use every day with a client.
Yeah. So if you guys want to do us a solid, Brett doesn't like that. If you want to do us a favor, go onto the interwebs, find us on YouTube, and subscribe to the show. And that is something that we really appreciate. You can go on Apple Podcasts, find us at Psych with Mike there, and leave us a rating and a comment, and that helps other people find the show, which is super beneficial. The music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue, and if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.